I need to help you Muslims out for a little problem. That is, one of the things that I have been doing is I've been holding these two books up next to each other, and I've been saying the Bible versus the Quran. And in some ways, I need to be careful with that, because in no way do we assume that the Bible is the same as the Quran. We don't have the same definition for both of them. We don't believe this was sent down tanzil, as you Muslims believe the Quran was sent down tanzil. Tanzil or nazil means sent down. God to Gabriel angel to a man named Muhammad. And therefore, it is a book, according to you, that has always existed. It has always been on those eternal tablets, according to Surah 85, Ayah 22, in heaven. We don't say that about the Bible at all. And so therefore, they probably are not a good comparison. So let me help you. Let me help you define terms here, because this will help us from here on out. Instead of comparing the Bible with the Quran, let's do this. Let's compare the New Testament with your traditions. Now, what do I mean that? Well, in your traditions, you have really four genres of tradition. You have the sayings of Muhammad, which are the Hadith. And we have the Hadith of the New Testament. You have the sayings of Jesus. If you look in a Bible that has a red letter edition, the red letters are the sayings of Jesus. That would be the same parallel to the Hadith of Muhammad. You also have the Sira of Rasulullah, which would be basically the biography of the Prophet of Allah, Muhammad, his story. And we have that same thing in the New Testament. We have it in the black letter part of the Gospels. It's Jesus' story, written down by those who were either with him or those who heard about it. So there you have the Sira of Jesus, the Hadith and the Sira of Jesus in the Gospel of Jesus Christ. And then you have the Tafsir, which are the commentaries on the Quran, because when you read the Quran, it's very confusing. You need an awful lot of help to understand what's being said in it. And so you go to Tabari, who was writing the Tafsir. He first wrote it down in 920s, early 10th century. Baidawi, Zamakshari, Suyuti, and others who come after him. We also have the Tafsir of Jesus, and that's Paul's letters. Paul comments on what Jesus said, and he basically expounds on it, and he basically houses it and puts it into a real-time framework, and that you find in the letters of Paul. So we have the Tafsir of Jesus in the letters of Paul. And then the fourth genre are the histories of all of mankind, ending with Muhammad, and that's called the Tahrikh. Do we have the Tahrikh of the Gospels, and certainly of Jesus? And the answer is yes, in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the story of the early church. There's our Tahrikh. So you have the Hadith of Jesus in the letter parts of the Gospel. You have the Sira of Jesus in the black letter parts of the Gospel. You have the Tafsir, which are the commentaries on Jesus' teachings in Paul's letters. And then you also have the Tahrikh, the histories, there in the book of Acts. So basically the New Testament is not the equivalent to the Qur'an. The New Testament is the equivalent to your traditions. So what's equivalent to the Qur'an? Well, you say the Qur'an is the Word of God. It is the eternal Word of God. It is the uncreated Word of God. That's a good one. Never been created. It coexists on those tablets according to Surah 85:22. Well, we also have the Word of God as well. Who is our Word of God? Who is the Kalimatu? The Word of God is Jesus himself. He is the Word, the eternal Word of God. He has always existed. He was never created. So if you're going to compare the Quran, compare it with Jesus. Jesus is our word versus the Quran as your word. Now, here's the interesting thing. The Gospels of Jesus, the story about him, his sayings, and his biography were written by those who were actually with Jesus. They were written down by men like John, Mark, Matthew. They were disciples with Jesus. They were with him for the last 3 years. They actually heard what he said. They were there. They were eyewitnesses to all the happenings that happened. So they were writing what they knew. Luke was not an eyewitness, but he got it from the eyewitnesses. That's why he says in the first 3 verses of the first chapter of Luke, "O Theophilus, I've taken it upon myself." He's basically taken on that work of writing what the other disciples had told him, and he was telling the disciples basically, tell me if I've got it wrong. So he's putting the fleece out there. Therefore, you might say, these are much more authoritative because they were written by people that were actually there. What about your traditions? Who wrote them down? Well, we know that the earliest traditions, Bukhari was the first one to write the sayings of Muhammad, and those were first written in about 850. He died in 870. That's almost 250 years after Muhammad's death. The Sira, which is the earliest material, written by Ibn Ishaq, though we don't have his material, we have to go to Ibn Hisham and Al-Waqidi. They didn't write their material down until the early 9th century, around 820 to 830, which means that's 200 years after the fact. The Tafsir of Tabari. Tabari was the first one to write the Tafsir down, the commentaries on the Quran, and he died in 923. That's the 10th century. He was also the first one to write down the Tahrikh, which are the histories. So that's 300 years after the fact. So everything we know about Muhammad, what he said, what he did, about the commentaries on how the Quran is to be understood, about the whole histories of mankind that Muslims are dependent upon, those 4 genres of traditions that I've just mentioned are all written in this 9th and 10th century for what was happening in the 7th century. 200 to 300 years after the fact. Whereas the Gospel of Jesus Christ, plus his Hadith, plus his Sira, plus the commentaries, plus also the history of Book of Acts, all of them were written within 30 to 40, as late as 50 years after Christ's death. 20 to 30 years versus 200 to 300 years, which is more authoritative? I'll go with 20 to 30 years. Written while the disciples were still living in Jerusalem, so they could corroborate and dispute anything that was said. Can you see how much more authoritative even our Tafsir and our Tahrikh and the Hadith and the Sira of Jesus is compared to yours? It's a good question. You say that you can't trust it, but I can. I'm wondering if we can trust your traditions. Why were they written so late? 200 to 300 years after the fact. Why can't we find things that were written at the time period when Muhammad was living? I leave that question with you. But if you want to come back to the historical Jesus, if you really want to come back to what he said and what he did, you better come back to that which was written by the eyewitnesses. That which was written by those who knew Jesus. Those who were loved by Jesus. Those who were with him for the last 3 years. Those who were there witnessing him on the cross, as John was. That's the authoritative story of Jesus. I can't say the same thing about the Quran and about your Muhammad. I leave that with you. This is Jathan, over and out.